I'm excited to welcome Lisa up to the stage. Lisa is a visual design strategist who takes infographics to the next level by transforming research insights into compelling visual stories and accessible data-driven designs. As head of visual design at Insight Strat 7, Lisa works with Fortune 500 companies, bringing in a wealth of experience by translating executive vision into comprehensive design strategies, building teams and managing workflows, and developing training programs and visual libraries to help researchers tell stories with inspiring impact. And with that, I'll welcome Lisa to the stage for her talk, Inclusive Segmentations, Bridging the Gap Without Bias. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you. Hi. Can you hear me? All right. Well, thank you for having me today. I'm so excited. So first, I want to throw a question out there. How do we build a more inclusive world? And inclusivity is all about representation, right? And balancing how we represent segmentation data without bias can be really challenging. So for today's talk, my goal is to have you walk away with a few ways of thinking about representing more inclusive profiles in your next project. A little bit about me. I specialize in empathy building visual experiences. I do custom illustrations and data viz, predominantly for UX and market research reports. So all the stuff you see here is pretty custom and based on projects that I've done that have been redacted. If you have any questions about them, please see me after. I really hope what you see here transfers over to things that you do as well. So let's start by getting on the same page. What is a segmentation or a segment profile? A segment profile is a fictional character used to represent a user type. And depending on your industry, you may have heard this phrase differently. It might be persona, a profile, a segment, but generally speaking, it's a characterization based on data. So let's look at an example of what a profile is. Meet John Doe. John Doe is this is a profile based on a financial profile I did for a market research company that was focused on how to improve their financial savviness with different tools. And you might notice a few things here, right? We've got on the very far left side his little bit of demographic info, his age, his household income. We've got his about information about the challenges he has with managing his finances, the opportunity he has to improve, his preferences, his motivators. But the first thing you might see when you look at this might not be those charts. It's probably going to be that photo, right? Because we're always drawn to looking at people and looking at photos. We can't help it. And let's think about this photo for a minute. What does it really tell us about John? Does it tell us much of a story about who he is or how he's handling these challenges in his profile? And when we look at Google and you look at profiles, you might notice a pattern here, right? You might notice that a lot of them have a very similar layout where they have a scorecard, they have very similar structure, but they'll have like a predominant photo image that defines who they are in a glance. And what do these photos really tell us about them? Can I get any shout outs? Is there anything that you're noticing about these photos? Anything that stand out about them? Yeah? They're smiling. Anything else? They're professional photos, yeah? Can I get one more? Most of them are white. Yeah, that does seem to be a trend here, doesn't it? So a lot of these are very focused on what they look like, based on how professional, how happy they are. But when we look at these, we can't really scan them and tell what these profiles are really even about. They all kind of look pretty generic, similar. And when it comes to personas, I often find when we look online, this is the case, and it's not necessarily inclusive. And it kind of more reminds me of that 90s game, Guess Who? Has anyone ever played Guess Who? Yeah? Have anyone ever really explored why that game has changed so much? If we looked at it in the 90s, a lot of the cards were similar to this, where they were all young, they're all similar racial profiles, similar gender. If you wanted to be, say, a little lady, you got immediately found out who you were because there's only one card. You might notice that Guess Who has actually gone through quite a big rebrand because it was called out for being so inclusive and so non-inclusive. So let's play our own version of this game. How can we approach our own natural biases? I'm going to show you these 4 images, and can you tell me which of these, do you think the first one is a stereotype or a bias? Raise your hand if you think this one, the boss. Yeah, all right, most of you, okay. How about the mom? Well, yeah, most of you too. What about the doctor? Oh, some, okay. And the small business owner? Okay, so how many do you think, so what made you kind of see through these? We looked at these pictures, we looked at who they are. I'm going to tell you which ones I think are biased here. All of them. So if you raised your hands all 4 times, you might have caught on to a few things that may not always be true. First off, the boss, he's in a very stereotypical image. He's in a suit, he's got a certain age, he's experienced. But this is something that we're just very used to seeing a lot of the time. It might not necessarily be true. The mom, a lot of moms nowadays are breadwinners, so you might not necessarily be a stay-at-home mom or even a soccer mom, or maybe she's the one playing soccer. And the doctor, we're in a time now where we are seeing more diversity in who's the doctor. It might not just be men, it could be women. And the small business owner, right, this is probably an image we all think about, that she owns a store and that she's in front of a cafe in an apron, but a lot of retail, especially for small business, is often online. And we can't help it sometimes. We see things all the time, and we have to conjure up an image in our head. So you might be wondering, well, all right, to be more inclusive, why don't we just throw away the images? Why don't we just not show a photo? Well, let's look at some stats. We all know that the brain processes visuals very well, and it's a really helpful learning tool and helpful for memorability. So we need to have some visual representation. Otherwise, we might try to conjure one up on our own and fall to our own biases of what we think that thing might be. On the other hand, we all do carry a natural bias. We make assumptions about other people even when we don't need to. You more than likely have an image in your head of a person before you even see what they look like, based on your own lived experiences. So when organizations need to select images of segments, it's challenging to avoid going off of what we already know or what we've already seen. And yet, personas still provide an important tool to help businesses find who they're looking for, and improve their value proposition. We need to better empathize and connect with people to help better serve them and serve each other and make the world a better place. And that's why segmentation research is so important to begin with. So if you're trying to represent research inclusively, you need to execute it in a way that gets away from what people are already inherently thinking in their mind when they see a photo. Instead, you need to bring it back to the situation, the roles, and the values that are widely more relatable. You don't want to narrow down a person to a single trait that you would actually exclude a lot of people. And even outside of research, you don't want to narrow down a problem or an audience to a single trait. So with that, I want to talk about this framework, Bridging the Gap. And this is a framework that I've used to help think about how can we make a more inclusive structure to thinking about how do we weigh our natural biases and our inclusive outliers. On one side of this bridge, you'll see natural bias, our lived experiences, our societal norms, profiling stereotypes, all of that right here. On the other side is the more inclusive context, the mindsets, needs, roles, and paths that are in the numbers, they're in the motivators, they're in the different scorecard things that you're asking when you put out a questionnaire or you go to do a data project with Qual or Quant. And our goal is to bring the two together and meet them and find a way to bridge that gap to be more inclusive with how we tell our stories. So we're going to explore 4 ways that you can bring your stories to life with more inclusive customer profiles. And I really hope they can be applicable to your work as they have been to mine. And I'm going to start with mindsets. Now, I'm showing you a profile that doesn't have a photo in it yet, but let's just look at the profile without a photo. This is a profile that has to do about a market research firm that was supporting a customer base that was trying to understand how do customers look into streaming services, particularly for parents. And so when we look at this data, you might see a few things stand out. Some of the headlines here are about children. The majority have more than 2. The features they care about are often centered around security. And I'm sorry, the if the letters are a little small on the screen. And the drivers, they're all very focused on how to protect their children, about how to look out for their needs, and how to create a more safety space for their children. So let's look at a common stock photo that could have been used for this situation. Now, I know we looked at this picture a moment ago for the mom profile, but well, let's take this apart a little bit more. What are we seeing in this image? Can I get any shout outs for what we see when we look at this image? Soccer, yeah, there's a soccer ball. Anything else?
Thin and able-bodied.
Right, thin and able-bodied. Can I get one more? Way too happy. Can't be happy. Right. Yeah. Well, there's a bunch of things here, right? But what aspect about her tells us that she's a parent? Yeah, there's no kid. There's nothing there that really tells you about who she is as parent. And really, what are we really looking at here? Like, who is this person? Does it really tell us and portray the traits that are in the data next to her, other than the fact that she is a woman? So let's go to the next slide. If we follow the bridge framework, right, and we put her on one side of the bridge, we're really looking at her natural bias traits, that she's a soccer mom, that she has a soccer ball, that she's happy, that she's a woman, that she's young, that she's in shape. But why don't we try to look at this from another perspective, right? So let's look at our inclusive outliers that were from that data set. It talked about her being a provider, her being caring, her defending her children. And this is where we really need the visual to go, towards the protective parent. So what if we tried something different with this image? Instead of showing a photo, what if we tried something like this and visualized it as a metaphor? Now, what traits is this image telling us? Can I get any shout outs?
Mama bear.
Mama bear, right. And what is the mom doing? Why is she the mom? What is she doing and who's behind her? She's protective. Yeah. And does it really matter that she's not a photo? Can you still kind of get the gist of what she's trying to do? So when you use something like a metaphor or a mindset that's focused on the visual, we're able to really bridge this gap and add another layer to the story. We're focusing beyond gender, beyond race, beyond these demographic profiling aspects, or even our natural bias, what we think she could have looked like, and focusing more on solving the problem. How do we reach parents? And how do we reach parents trying to protect their kids? And so when you see this in the profile, it actually leverages the data really nicely because it kind of brings you more into the data set about, okay, I get she's protective. Why is she protective? What does she care about? What's important here? And it adds a new layer of inclusivity to the story that might broaden it to beyond being about just moms. It could be anybody, but it's still in the same stance. So a few things that to take away from the mindsets. One is that we're really looking at how do we find the situation, the value, the nuance, the mindset of what we're trying to represent with data and numbers. Now, I know I just used an animal analogy and that might not always work. So I am going to show a variety of different industry examples and I'm going to follow up with the needs, right? So when we look at needs, once again, let's bring back John Doe from earlier. Hi, John. So here's John in his button-up shirt, hanging out on the other side of the bridge. He's just a guy. What do we really know about him here? So let's look at the other side of the bridge, the inclusive outliers that we mentioned before. We've got his list of responsibilities. He needs help manage his finances. He's unable to grow in his career. So, probably not in every situation, animal like the last one would work. And in this case, it's really important to focus on his drivers, his needs, his tasks. His tasks were one of the key things that set him apart. And so instead of representing him with a character of a bear, it made sense to focus on what he was doing, the actions he was doing, like a juggler juggling tasks. Now you might look at this and say, well, gee, this is still a person, right? Well, it's a characterization of a person. It's a character that we're familiar with if you've been into a circus or if you've seen this role of somebody juggling and being stressed. It's an analogy and a visual metaphor to help explain what he's doing, and what is stressing him out is the action he's doing. He's trying to juggle all these things. And say we needed to apply this to more than one person. I often, in my work, have at least 3 to 4 segments in a project, not just the one, and I need to be able to compare them. So say there was more than one characterization of people that needed to be shown that all had relatively similar household incomes, maybe a range of spending power, but not super wide. But what made them really different was how they managed their tasks, similar to John. Well, this is where I really like using a theme with an analogy, such as in this case, managing the chaos of spending and showing it as a circus, where each person is performing a different activity or a different task, but they're doing it a little bit differently and trying to solve the same problem. One is walking the tightrope, one is managing a lion, all a little bit different. And when you put this in context of a matrix, it's a little bit easier to see what's similar and different about them. How confident are they? What's their level of tasks? And you can kind of get another layer of information here that you might not have been able to with a photo. Another example I like to show is this from a retail project I had where they were trying to understand how to have more loyal customers. And in this one too, I do use images of people. But what was important to the client in this one is that you still are in the world of the retail space, that they were still people in the retail space performing activities, but they are mixed and they are in different body languages to show what they are interacting with. So when we put them in a plot and we have each characterization side by side, each one is showing you a little bit about how they are confident in their shopping decisions, their budget, their income, and their customer service experience. And this is helpful because it kind of builds off of what you already have there in the numbers, but shows you how they're interacting in the same situation with similar tools. And the environment is such a useful way to navigate visual storytelling. Next, I'm going to get into roles. Now, regardless of the project, you can often get into a situation where there is still a level of hierarchy. And in this situation, I was working with a B2B service client who was trying to uncover how to better deliver marketing strategies and different roles in an organization. Which role would they be able to support in different ways? And on the bottom, we have the busy bees. And as they ladder up, they all interact with the situation differently as they go to different management levels: engineers, IT managers, the captain, the visionary, and the gatekeeper. And in each situation, the people that it's leveling to have a very different way of solving the same problem, or this very different way of interacting with their space while often performing the same task. The last one of the four that I'm going to get into is paths. And I find this to be a very helpful one that actually probably shows people the least. When I work with healthcare clients, such as this one, often you're working with very sensitive patient information, and showing a patient profile can actually be very challenging because you don't want to show sensitive information or sad information, especially in cancer research. So when we look at things like paths, it's a really helpful way to show not just who they are, but what are they dealing with? What's on the road ahead? Are they climbing a cliff? Are they in a pleasant valley? What's their situation like? This also comes up with how windy is the road. You know, some roads can easily take you off a cliff if you're not too careful. Others can be a little bit more rigid and corporate and stiff, black and white. And like in this opportunistic path, it can be a very happy, pleasant path with lots of choices and a golden horizon. And these don't even show people. It's all about the vehicle that they use to get there and what does the road lead to. And finally, I'd like to show this example from a music streaming project I worked on, where we looked at how did people navigate relating to customers when they're listening to music and how they relate to their content throughout the day. And it really didn't make sense to show a person's face because you're talking about sound and movement and things that they're doing. So as they go through, it can ripple. It can be polarized, whether they're listening to it or they're not, they turn it off. It can be rising, where they crescendo and decrescendo as they listen, and it can be scattered. Some final takeaways. When we think about visualizing a more inclusive space, here's the things that I would definitely recommend. Start by thinking about who are you designing for? Who are they? When you take away the demographic info, what are the really key findings that you have? What do they do? What tasks are they performing? How are they interacting with the world around them? Where does the path lead? What are their goals? What are they trying to do? When do they act? And how does their behavior fluctuate? We can build a more inclusive world together. And I invite you to think about ways that you can apply this to your own work. How can I build more inclusivity into my next project? It starts with admitting that we do have our own natural biases. We can't help it. We're in this world and we see people all the time. And then it's a matter of looking at ways that we can take apart the situation, values, and nuance to better understand how we can represent people with empathy and creativity. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate being here. Thank you.
All right. I love seeing so many charts in your talk of plotting information. And so I think there's a lot of interesting insights there that take the idea that we keep hearing over and over again around how do we go ahead and understand our audience more and then make it into something concrete. So let's go ahead and go to questions up here. Letitia, we'll start on this side and then move off to the opposite.
Lisa, thank you for your time. So one of the things that I keep thinking when I hear you talk is that you started talking about the fact that we need representation, but at the same time, when I see the work, it is more about representing, less about representing people and more about representing their behavior. And although I understand that perspective, I do think that this is an opportunity for us to explore how we could show non-binary people in a way that actually represents them, or Black people in a way that actually represents them. Coming from a country where we show a lot of white thin women as well and have such diversity, we really, sometimes we also go through the same thing and we have to implement that in our work. So for me, that's a bit counterintuitive. So I wanted to understand in your perspective, how do you see those creative thinkings, as you said, a way of representing as representation? Because for me, it looks like the opposite.
Thank you. That's a great question. I did pick a selection of different models of it. So to be fair, there probably are other ways to do it that could show more skin tone, more range. And I think there is value to that. In my examples, I was trying to show an alternative to showing a photo. But there are ways of using photography to still be inclusive. I do think it's a matter of just avoiding the stereotype, avoiding this is the first person you see when you see a mom, that it's always this. And if you do use photography, or if you are trying to show more than one person, I think actually showing multiple versions of them is important, not just showing one variation that, say, I'm used to, showing people that are from different countries, people that are different age. You know, we always associate a mom with being young. That's not really true anymore. There's such a range of who can be a mom now. So I think that's a really good, important build, and I agree that it's an important one. I would say it matters in what space you're doing it. If you're doing a report, you should be doing multiple slides that show different variations of what they look like. And if you're doing it in a single image, like say you only have 4 profiles, I think that's where you do have to be cognizant to make sure you vary who you're showing, age, demographic profile, color, everything, to make sure that you're trying to fit that in. So I hope that answers your question. I think that's an excellent point.
Okay, I think it's a whole conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
To the side.
I have a process question, especially the health outcomes metaphor. I thought was really powerful. And you obviously work a lot with metaphor and analogy to make these substantive comparisons. What's your process like for coming up with those?
That's a great question. Well, I'm an illustrator by nature. I kind of was an illustrator before I got into data viz. So I think about it a lot like a creative process, about how do I play with different types of character building skills to build a concept around who somebody is and how you can represent them. I kind of go a lot back to children's books and stories and things that I see, and I often actually do a pretty big brainstorm where I sketch, and I sketch probably at least a dozen or so different versions of the same thing to see where I take it. And I think sketching, especially for character building or personas or segments, is a really important tool, because I never think the first design you sketch is the right one. I think it's just the one that you feel the most comfortable with because it's the first one you came up with. So if you're trying to get into this, I recommend start by sketching. I use what I call the cube method, where I time myself for a minute and I try one idea out and I sketch and sketch and sketch. And then the timer goes off, I set another minute and I try another way that I could do it. I try an analogy, I try nature. And I look at a lot of concept art to help inspire myself as well. So I hope that helps get the ball rolling, and I'm happy to talk more about it.
Chuck, do we have a question from online?
Question from online from Lawrence Buck from a UX design perspective. why does the visual representation really matter? Could you change the visual to relevant info that we need to do to accomplish our work? For example, demographic data with actual customer distributions.
I'm trying to pick that apart. So is the question, can you do it without a visual? Is that the question?
I'm taking that as why add the visual if it just creates controversy, and instead just focusing on the profile characteristics that you've highlighted that are important.
I see. So by showing it in the writing and in the data. Well, I think we have an unconscious and natural bias that I think I walked through earlier, but what happens is we all have these lived experiences where we see people doing activities, people doing certain things around us, or people playing certain roles. And when you leave it to somebody to come up with who that customer is, they often will go with someone that they're the most familiar with, which might be okay in some contexts, but the challenge with that is it doesn't push us to think beyond what we're used to, and it doesn't help us build empathy with people who are different. An example that I wish I showed was actually about accessibility and how I think we often assume, people can't do things or assume that people have certain limitations, but it's important to assume that people can, and to assume that there's a wider range of people that need to be universally designed for. And when we only design for who we are familiar with, or only focus on the traits or do it in writing, we don't really open up an opportunity to focus on a more cognitive, memorable way to connect with it. It's also for memorability. You need to remember what you're learning about. And companies often want to be able to build a relationship with who you're talking about. I mean, I've had plenty of projects where the John Doe in the situation was referenced after, like, oh yeah, can we meet Joe? Can we work on John a little bit more and talk more about his experience? Can we meet more people like it? Like, it builds a narrative and it helps you remember and build a story around them and build a relationship. So you could take them out, but I think the cost would be an opportunity to connect. I hope that helps.
I think your accessibility point makes me think of the nothing about us without us that often comes down in accessibility, and the importance of having those people as part of those design conversations too. Question up here to the side.
Yeah, so we might not be in charge of the personas, right, that are developed for certain companies. Is there any advice for like pushing up and communicating to those people that are using the personas as why we shouldn't be using them, the John Does?
Yeah, so actually, from my own experiences, most places I started out with, my job just didn't exist. I came in and basically was like, hey, you really need to think about inclusivity when you're designing for people. You really need to have a connection with who your personas are and think about how you're delivering in a way that connects with them. So what I would recommend is, and I'm very much a presentation gal, I usually would bring in a few stats and a few key slides to be like, this is what other places are doing and why it's helping them. This will help us be more competitive, but it'll also improve how we empathize and build our base with who we're trying to work with. And if it's hard to invest in it right away, and it's something that they need more support on, there's some very simple ways to get into entry with segmentations, whether it be to do something like a small survey or to just start even with a panel of customers as a small foundational way to start at least engaging in the conversation. And it's a really nice way to just at least start to build a relationship with your customers, or build a relationship with the people you're working with and their teams on how are we really thinking about them. I also think workshops are a really valuable tool. I've used them to help build in how do you think about people and how do we explore what the future could look like. And that way, when you're doing the research and you're building your questions around being more inclusive and thinking about customers, it helps you kind of think about your team and how your team also is talking about them. I hope it's helpful. I'd love to talk more about it.
Well, and I think that's probably a good place to end on as we get ready to go to our coffee break. I do think that this topic around kind of UX artifacts and personas, mindsets, all those components are something that come up when we think about kind of who our audience is for data visualization. They create these things we can talk about and look at as a team, which can be really valuable. There's also a lot of really deep conversation that's happened in the design field around some of the broader challenges of the stereotypes we have in creating those personas that in your examples, you have so much data underpinning them. We don't always have that luxury as we're crafting the personas for our dashboard users or someone else, that I think could be a great jump off to some really fascinating conversations over the coffee break, this last coffee break of the day, and over on Slack, where I think there'll be more conversations and requests for more resources, ideas, and tools. So could we get a round of applause for Lisa as we wrap up this section?
Thank you.
Thank you.